Okay, welcome back. This is the first of several lectures in which we examine the nervous system with regard to the head and neck. So in this lecture, we will examine the gross anatomy of the brain, including the cerebrum, which is the largest region of the brain. We'll differentiate the various lobes of the brain. We'll examine the ventricles that surround the structures of the central nervous system and bathe them in cerebrospinal fluid. We'll examine cerebrospinal fluid, and we'll look at its composition and its functions, and we'll examine the functions of the structures of the cerebrum. Now, as you might have noticed, we have a ton to get through in this lecture, so let's get started. I hope that you will recall this image from way back in section 2, and remember that I removed the brain from the skull, and I said no disrespect to the brain, as we will revisit it later on. Well, re-enter stage center, your brain. In the last section, we were discussing the dural sinuses, and I pointed out for you a few of the gross anatomical features of the brain. So I want to expand on that in this lecture. So here we see a lateral projection of the brain. Now, do you know which side of the brain we're looking at? Does it help you to know that this end is the front or anterior end of the brain, and this is the rear or posterior end? If you now recognize this as the left side of your brain, then you are correct. Well done. So you learned in the previous section that the majority of your brain is this large area here, which you now know as the cerebrum. Now we see only one half of the cerebrum here, and we refer to the halves as hemispheres. So we can call this a cerebral hemisphere. Now you have already identified this as the left side of the brain, so we can call this the left cerebral hemisphere. You know this portion back here as the cerebellum. Yes, you certainly can call this the left cerebellar hemisphere. You see a portion of the brain stem right here. Now recall that the spinal cord enters the skull through the foramen magnum in order to connect with the brain stem. See how everything is coming together? We'll examine the brainstem closer in a couple of lectures from now. Now the cerebrum is covered with a superficial layer of gray matter that we call the neural cortex, also known as the cerebral cortex. I think that you will agree that your cerebrum has a very distinctive appearance. So distinctive, in fact, that this is called brain coral, due to the fact that it looks, well, like your brain. Now that very distinctive appearance is the result of the folds and crevices in the cerebral cortex. Now I liken the cerebral cortex to a series of mountains and valleys. So these elevated ridges, or mountains if you will, are called gyri, singular is gyrus. The valleys then are sulci, singular is sulcus. Now the really deep and long valleys are called fissures, and that's just to distinguish them from sulci. So just like the cranial bones are named according to their locations, remember frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital bones, so the regions of the cerebral cortex are like named. And we call these regions lobes. Now, by the way, there are functional differences in the lobes, which we will discuss momentarily. And so we have then the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital lobes of the cerebral cortex. Now, during early development of your brain, the ventricles form. Ventricles are hollow chambers or spaces within the structures of your brain. Now, in this projection, you are looking through the transparent left cerebral hemisphere and into the brain at the ventricles. So there are 4 ventricles identified as first, second, third, and fourth. Now, because the first and second ventricles are identical, just on opposite sides of the cerebrum, we call them together the lateral ventricles. And so you see the third ventricle here. The fourth ventricle is here, down in the brainstem. Now the fourth ventricle connects the central canal of your spinal cord, you haven't seen that yet, to the third ventricle and obviously to the cerebrum proper. Now like the central canal, the ventricles are filled with cerebrospinal fluid. More on that shortly. Now in this lateral frontal side-by-side comparison, you can see the lateral ventricles. Now on the frontal, you see both lateral ventricles, one in the right hemisphere and one in the left. Now by the way, this is the longitudinal fissure here that separates the 2 cerebral hemispheres. So here is the third ventricle. Now you can see in the front how narrow the third ventricle really is. Your fourth ventricle is here. In the frontal, you can see how the central canal of the spinal cord is connected via the fourth ventricle to the third ventricle in the cerebrum proper. So here are a couple of CT scans of the brain. On the left, you see the large left and right lateral ventricles. And on the right, this is referred to as a sagittal view, by the way, you see the right cerebral hemisphere here. And so you have the lateral ventricle, the third ventricle, and the top of the fourth ventricle. So the ventricles are continuous with the subarachnoid space. Here in blue is the subarachnoid space, which you can see completely surrounds your brain. It's also continuous with the meninges of the spinal cord, as you see down here. So you're familiar with the arachnoid mater, at least by name, from our discussion of the dural sinuses. Now back then I noted the three cranial meninges, the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. Now recall that the meninges are the layers of neural tissue surrounding and protecting your brain and separating your brain from your skull. Now you've seen this illustration before. The dura mater is the tough outer layer, and that's where you find the dural sinuses, of course. The pia mater is the delicate innermost layer. Now, this is a layer that is in direct contact with your brain. The middle layer, then, is the arachnoid mater. It's so named because it looks kind of like a spider's web. So the subarachnoid space, then, is just that. It's the space below the arachnoid mater. And so I told you that the ventricles are continuous with the subarachnoid space. Now, because the ventricles are filled with cerebral spinal fluid, so too is the subarachnoid space, which means that your entire brain is sitting in a big pool, if you will, of cerebral spinal fluid. And so why is that important? Okay, let's take a breather for a few seconds and talk about cerebrospinal fluid. Now, we've already established the fact that cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, fills the ventricles of the brain and the central canal of the spinal cord, effectively surrounding and bathing, if you will, the structures of the central nervous system, that's your brain and spinal cord. Now, as an aside, you've heard, I'm sure, of Spinal Tap. Now, I'm not referring to the heavy metal band from the 1980s. I mean the medical procedure, where they surgically remove a small sample of CSF. Now, because the cerebrospinal fluid intermixes with the interstitial fluid, clinicians can tell a lot about the health of a person by examining CSF. So spinal tap, or lumbar puncture, because they normally do it in the lower back, is relatively common with pregnant women and children to check for infections like meningitis. So as you might imagine, the brain and spinal cord are extremely delicate, so the cerebrospinal fluid cushions these important structures and protects them from the normal and not so normal stresses of life. CSF supports the brain, which is literally floating in fluid, and cerebrospinal fluid transports nutrients to the brain and takes waste products away from the brain. In this sagittal view of the right brain and brainstem, we can identify a number of structures. So to keep you oriented, here's the frontal lobe, this is your parietal lobe, and here's your occipital lobe. You will recognize, of course, the fourth ventricle down here. Now, you already know this area as the right cerebral hemisphere. And so you can see the corpus callosum. Corpus callosum is a bundle of horizontal axons that connect your left and right cerebral hemispheres. They allow communication between the left and right brains. Now, I have a great image of the corpus callosum to show you in a minute, although you've seen it before. This is the area of the third ventricle. Now, within the third ventricle, we see this little mass of tissue right here, which you will now know as the choroid plexus. The cells of the choroid plexus actually produce cerebrospinal fluid, so that's pretty cool. Now there's a little bump right there, which is your pineal or pineal gland. The pineal gland is part of your endocrine system, so I'll hold discussion on that until the final lecture of this section. Your cerebellum is here. We'll check that out in the next lecture. This elongated structure is your brainstem. We'll dissect the brainstem in a couple of lectures from now. And that makes this the spinal cord. So this little structure hanging down here is the pituitary gland. Again, that's part of your endocrine system, which we will examine later. Now looking back up at the area of the third ventricle, this area contains the thalamus and the area below the thalamus, or hypothalamus. We call those two areas together the diencephalon. Again, this is endocrine system. So I told you that I had a cool image to show you, and here it is. You've seen this before. So this area is the corpus callosum. You see how it sits between the cerebral hemispheres. Its axons run horizontally from side to side, thereby connecting the two hemispheres. And so in this way, your left brain is able to communicate with your right brain. There are some 200 to 250 million axons making up the corpus callosum. And you'll recall that the corpus callosum is all white matter. So in this sagittal side by side, we see the cadaver brain on the right and an MRI on the left. So to keep you oriented then, here's your frontal lobe. As you can see, they are on opposite sides of the screen, which means that the MRI is showing the right cerebral hemisphere and the cadaver brain is the left cerebral hemisphere. And that's just fine because you remember that the human organism is roughly symmetrical. So we have the cerebrum up here. Below that you see the corpus callosum. Here you see the cerebellum. And here's your brainstem. And here it is on the MRI. And that means that this is the spinal cord. So the foramen magnum is located roughly there. You see the diencephalon in the third ventricle. Again, that's thalamus and hypothalamus. And here it is on the MRI. So to wrap up this section on gross anatomy, let's talk about function. First, there are several things you must understand and appreciate about your cerebral cortex. Each hemisphere receives sensory information from and sends motor commands to the opposite side of the body. There is a crossing over of nerves in the brainstem such that your right hemisphere controls the left side of your body, and vice versa. The left hemisphere controls the right side of your body. That is precisely the reason that a person who has a stroke on the right side of the brain loses function on the left side of the body. Now, while the hemispheres look the same, they are functionally different. So morphologically, the right and left hemispheres are mirror images of one another. Functionally, however, the two hemispheres are responsible for vastly different things. We'll check out those functions momentarily. Now, most important, perhaps, I really want you to understand that while specific functions can be identified, their regions of origin can only be generalized. So what that means is we can pinpoint the area that, for example, movement of the right hand originates, the left precentral gyrus. However, how much of the left precentral gyrus is involved in movement of the right hand versus the fingers, the wrist, and the forearm is not clearly understood, and in fact many of those areas actually overlap. So for example, you see the areas of the cortex devoted to the movements of the fingers, the wrist, the forearm, and the elbow. But you can also clearly see here that there is much overlapping of those areas. In fact, things like consciousness cannot be assigned to any specific region of the brain. All of that to say this: the human organism is complex in structure and vastly complex in function. As much as we know about the structure and function of the human machine, there remains, and I dare say will always remain, much, much more that we don't know or will ever even understand. Now, I showed you this illustration some time ago, and we identified the lobes of the cerebral cortex according to their locations, just as we did with the cranial bones in section 2. And so once again, we have the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, and occipital lobe. So we are able to assign various motor and sensory functions to each of the lobes. And so it goes like this. The frontal lobe is your primary motor cortex. In other words, it governs voluntary control of skeletal muscles. Now, you've learned before that skeletal muscle is completely voluntary. Now you know where that control comes from. Your parietal lobe is your primary sensory cortex. So perception of touch, pressure, pain, vibration, taste, and temperature is perceived here in the parietal lobe. So here's another great example of overlapping influence. If you stick your hand in very hot water, then you will perceive touch, temperature, and pain simultaneously. So all of those sensations are processed in the parietal lobe. The temporal lobe contains your auditory, that's hearing, and olfactory, that's smell, cortices. So in other words, the temporal lobe processes sounds and smells. Your occipital lobe is all about vision, and all of the lobes have association areas. All of these cortices take part in integrating and processing of sensory data or initiation of motor activity. And that looks like this. So the groove here is the central sulcus, which is an important landmark, as we will see in a moment. You've seen this already, and you're able to locate the various lobes of the cerebral cortex. So I want to remove these labels just to give us some room. Now we're talking about locating the various functional and accessory areas of the cerebral cortex. So here again is your central sulcus. This area here of the frontal lobe is the motor association area. Now because it comes before the motor cortex, we call it also the premotor cortex. The area here is your primary motor cortex. Now because it lies here before the central sulcus, we call it the precentral gyrus. And so the area just posterior to the central sulcus is the primary sensory cortex, and so we refer to this area as the postcentral gyrus. The remainder of the parietal lobe is your sensory association area. Your occipital lobe is all about vision, so this is your visual association area, and the tip of the occipital lobe is your visual cortex. The area here is your auditory, remember that's hearing, association area, and your auditory cortex then is right there. Now admittedly there is a lot going on in this slide, so I have included it as a PDF download, which you will of course find in your resources section. So you'll remember that your visual cortex is back here. Now that governs vision or sight of course. Your auditory cortex is here, and that's your sense of hearing. So if we open a little window into the cerebral cortex so that we can see inside, then we have two areas pop out at us. In green we see the gustatory cortex, that's your sense of taste, and in yellow we see the olfactory cortex, that's your sense of smell. So here we see the cortices of 4 of your 5 special senses, the other being touch. We'll look at all of the special senses in the next section. So if we look at the superior aspect of the cerebral cortex, just to give you a different perspective, then we see the longitudinal fissure here. And the longitudinal fissure separates the left and right hemispheres. Your central sulcus is here, and that separates the anterior from the posterior cortex. Here is your frontal lobe. Your precentral gyrus is right here. And remember, that's your primary motor cortex. Now, by the way, the area here, roughly, is your prefrontal cortex. I mentioned it here, and we'll detail it later. So down here you see your parietal lobe. Here is your postcentral gyrus. Remember, that's primary sensory cortex. And finally, way down here, you see only part of the occipital lobe. And of course, in this projection, you do not see the temporal lobe at all. So once again, there's a lot going on here, so you have this as a PDF in your resources. Okay, let's take a little breather. Integrative centers are areas of the cortex that receive information from various association centers and by definition integrate or combine multiple sensory impulses and subsequently translate them into a motor response. So integrative centers or ICs are responsible for very complex motor activities. Think of, for example, sculpting or painting, which require very complex motor skills. ICs allow you to perform very complicated and abstract analytical functions as well. Well, that explains why I always had a headache in calculus class. Integrative centers are located in the lobes and cortical areas of either hemisphere, but not both. So in other words, if you have them in your right hemisphere, then you usually will not have them in your left hemisphere. And by the way, ICs are more commonly located in a person's left hemisphere. So there are three integrative centers for us to look at. The first is your prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex integrates information received from multiple association areas. Now, by so doing, it allows you to perform abstract intellectual functions. So, for example, your prefrontal cortex allows you to predict the future consequences of your present actions. Feelings of frustration, tension, and anxiety are generated at the prefrontal cortex as well, as it interprets ongoing events. The second IC is your speech area. It's also known as Broca's area, after French physician Pierre Broca linked the speech impairments of his patients to damage in the same area of the cortex. That also was 19th century. It's also referred to as the motor speech area. Now, it regulates your breathing and vocalizations. Recall time. Where do you generate sound for speech? All right, give yourself a pat on the back if you answered voice box or larynx. Go on, I'll wait. Pat yourself on the back. Good job. Now, regulation involves coordinating the respiratory muscles, the muscles of the larynx and pharynx, and the facial muscles as needed for normal speech. Motor commands issued by the speech center are adjusted by feedback input from the receptive speech area, which you know as the auditory association area. Damage to this area of the cortex can cause any number of speech-related problems, including stuttering and aphasia. So the third integrative center is your general interpretive area. Now, this is also known as Wernicke's area, after German neurologist Karl Wernicke linked reflexive mimicking of words and syllables to damage in the same area of the cortex. Again, 19th century. It's also referred to as the Gnostic area. Gnostic is just a word that means knowledge. So the general interpretive area receives information from all of your sensory association areas, and it plays an essential role in the formation of your personality by integrating sensory information with your visual and auditory memories. Because the general interpretive area is linked to both the visual and auditory memory centers, damage to this area of the cortex can affect your ability to interpret what is seen or heard. So, for example, damage to one part of Wernicke's area may leave you able to see and recognize a chair, but unable to name it chair due to the disruption of the connection to your visual association area. Some forms of dyslexia are the result of problems processing and integrating visual information. So let's locate them. Your prefrontal cortex is here. Now, don't confuse that with the premotor cortex, right? Here is your speech center, that's Broca or Broca's area. And here is your general interpretive area, that's Wernicke or Wernicke's area. Now I'll give you a second to wrap your cerebral cortex around this image. I'm not trying to be funny here. This is no joke. This is a real thing. Okay, this little guy is called homunculus. Homunculus is just a Latin word that means little man. This happens to be motor homunculus. We'll meet his brother in a moment. So this little guy is representative of the amount of your motor cortex that is devoted to the various parts of your body. So the size of the body part here demonstrates that idea. In other words, the larger the body part, the more motor cortex is devoted to that part. So for example, note the size of the lips, meaning that a bunch of your motor cortex is devoted to the control and manipulation of your lips. Now, that's not something that we really think about, but if you've ever watched a primate eating on one of those animal channels, then you will appreciate how much the lips can be manipulated. Likewise, look at the size of the tongue. Again, not something we really give much thought to, but recall from section 3 that your tongue is, for all intents and purposes, all muscle. And so if you are able to do this, or know someone who can, then you will certainly appreciate the motor control that we have over our tongues. You have undoubtedly noticed the size of motor homunculus's hands. So a great deal of your motor cortex is concentrated to your hands. And we can do amazing things with our hands, and that fact is no more poignant, I think, than when considering the hands of the neurosurgeon. Just imagine the hand-eye coordination and fine motor skills necessary to operate on someone's brain and actually have them survive. But by contrast, comparatively little motor cortex is devoted to the genitals and even the feet. So compare that guy to this guy. This is motor's brother, sensory. And so the first thing that you noticed, I'm sure, is the genitals. Suffice to say that there are a great number of sensory nerve endings here, and for this reason a good proportion of sensory cortex is devoted to this area. The lips are still very large here. Again, your lips are an extremely sensitive part of your body, and your sensory cortex bears that out. And maybe that's why kissing is so much fun. The hands are still prominent here. Again, lots of sensory cortex devoted to this very sensitive body part. And you've noticed, I'm sure, that the feet are more prominent here as well. And again, you can appreciate that, well, if you're ticklish. Finally, as we wrap this lecture up, if you're taking a live anatomy course concurrent with this course, or if you're using this course as a review before taking your MCAT, DAT, CDA exam, CLEP biology, or any of a number of other certification tests, then you've probably seen homunculus in this presentation. So we have sensory homunculus here, and we have motor homunculus here. Now these two-dimensional figures display the same information as the three-dimensional figures that I used earlier. So kudos to you for hanging in there. We've covered a lot of ground in this lecture. So in the next lecture, we will check out the gross anatomy of the cerebellum. So I will see you shortly.